When Serena Kane became Malibu's most spiritual yoga guru, students trusted her to heal their minds and bodies. But when her cult-like obsession with control and hidden past consumed her, she began using toxic incense and meditation techniques to brainwash and murder wealthy clients, turning spiritual enlightenment into deadly manipulation. Before we get to this wonderful story, please subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Now, let's get back to the story. The Pacific Ocean waves crashed against the Malibu cliffs as Serena Kane arranged crystals and burning sage around her oceanfront yoga studio, preparing for what would become the most dangerous spiritual session of her 9-year career as California's most sought-after yoga instructor and wellness guru. At 38 years old, Serena had established herself as the West Coast's premier spiritual healer, combining ancient yoga traditions with modern mindfulness techniques that attracted Hollywood celebrities, tech billionaires, and wealthy socialites seeking transcendence from their materialistic lifestyles through her exclusive retreat programs. Serena's Lotus Light Wellness Center occupied a stunning clifftop location in Malibu's most exclusive neighborhood, featuring panoramic ocean views, meditation gardens filled with rare botanicals, and treatment rooms equipped with sound healing instruments, aromatherapy systems, and specialized lighting designed to induce altered states of consciousness. Her client roster included A-list actors preparing for demanding film roles, stressed executives seeking work-life balance, and wealthy widows searching for meaning after personal tragedies who were willing to pay premium prices for her transformative spiritual guidance. The interior of Serena's studio reflected her carefully cultivated image as an enlightened spiritual master, featuring walls adorned with Tibetan prayer flags, ancient Sanskrit texts, and photographs of her studying with renowned gurus in India and Nepal. Her credentials included advanced yoga certifications from prestigious ashrams, training in various meditation techniques, and testimonials from grateful students whose lives had been completely transformed through her guidance and wisdom. But beneath Serena's spiritual facade lay a dangerous combination of narcissistic personality disorder, financial desperation, and a criminal past that had driven her to systematically brainwash and murder wealthy students while stealing their assets through psychological manipulation and coercive control. "Good morning, Serena," said Isabella Montgomery, her 11 o'clock private session client and a 45-year-old pharmaceutical heiress whose recent divorce settlement had left her with over $30 million and a desperate search for spiritual meaning following her husband's betrayal. Isabella had been attending Serena's classes for 8 months, gradually becoming more dependent on her instructor's guidance and increasingly isolated from friends and family who had expressed concerns about her dramatic personality changes. "Good morning, Isabella," Serena replied with the ethereal serenity and mystical wisdom that had made her legendary among Malibu's spiritually seeking elite, who viewed her as both teacher and enlightened being capable of providing access to higher consciousness and divine truth. "I've been receiving powerful visions about your spiritual journey, and today's session will involve some advanced techniques that will help you release the final barriers preventing your complete awakening and transformation into your highest self." Isabella had become Serena's most valuable target, not because of her spiritual seeking or emotional vulnerability, but because of her substantial wealth and her growing dependence on Serena's approval and guidance for making major life decisions. Over months of intensive private sessions, Serena had been systematically isolating Isabella from her support network, while manipulating her into signing over increasing amounts of money for advanced spiritual training and karmic debt cleansing that would supposedly accelerate her path to enlightenment. What Isabella didn't know was that Serena had been systematically brainwashing and murdering wealthy students for over 3 years, using psychological manipulation, toxic substances, and coercive control techniques to eliminate clients who threatened to expose her fraudulent activities. Serena's transformation from legitimate yoga instructor to calculating killer had begun 5 years earlier, when her real identity as Sarah Collins, a former psychiatric patient with a history of violence and fraud convictions, had been discovered by a suspicious student who had conducted background research. Faced with exposure of her criminal past and the collapse of her carefully constructed spiritual persona, Serena had murdered the student and decided that eliminating threatening clients was essential for protecting her profitable wellness business. Her criminal activities had been facilitated by her extensive knowledge of psychology, hypnosis, and mind control techniques that she had learned during her psychiatric treatment and had weaponized to exploit vulnerable, wealthy individuals seeking spiritual guidance. Her first victim had been Dr. Patricia Williams, a prominent psychiatrist who had recognized signs of Serena's personality disorder and had begun asking questions about her qualifications and therapeutic methods. Serena had murdered Dr. Williams using a combination of psychoactive plant extracts hidden in ceremonial tea and psychological manipulation that had convinced the psychiatrist to participate in a dangerous spiritual cleansing ritual that had resulted in fatal poisoning while appearing to be a tragic accident during alternative healing practices. The success of her first murder had convinced Serena that killing suspicious or wealthy students was both necessary for protecting her identity and extremely profitable when combined with systematic psychological manipulation of grieving families and inheritance fraud. Over the following 3 years, Serena had murdered 8 additional students using increasingly sophisticated methods that combined toxic botanical substances, psychological coercion, and staged spiritual accidents that eliminated potential threats while providing access to substantial financial assets through forged wills, coercive donations, and inheritance manipulation. Her victims had included Robert Chen, a tech entrepreneur whose cryptocurrency holdings had been transferred to Serena's accounts through coercive psychological manipulation; Jennifer Martinez, a wealthy socialite whose estate planning had been altered to benefit Serena's spiritual mission; and David Foster, a prominent attorney whose suspicious death during a meditation retreat had been attributed to pre-existing heart conditions rather than deliberate poisoning. Serena, I need to discuss some serious concerns about unusual patterns I've observed in your wellness programs and several suspicious deaths among your students, said Dr. Amanda Rodriguez, a clinical psychologist who specialized in investigating cult manipulation and had been hired by concerned families to evaluate Serena's methods and their effects on vulnerable individuals. Dr. Rodriguez possessed extensive expertise in recognizing coercive psychological techniques and had access to resources for exposing fraudulent spiritual practitioners. Dr. Rodriguez's investigation represented an existential threat to Serena's criminal operation, as her psychological expertise and access to cult investigation resources could expose the systematic manipulation and connect her to multiple suspicious deaths. Of course, Dr. Rodriguez, Serena replied, though she felt the familiar surge of rage and paranoia that accompanied any scrutiny of her spiritual methods by mental health professionals who possessed the expertise to recognize her psychological manipulation techniques. I'm always interested in discussing the profound transformations that occur when individuals commit themselves fully to authentic spiritual practice and the healing power of ancient wisdom traditions. Dr. Rodriguez consulted detailed psychological assessments and behavioral analyses that she had compiled based on interviews with former students and their families, pointing to specific patterns of isolation, financial exploitation, and psychological dependency that indicated systematic cult manipulation rather than legitimate spiritual instruction. Librarian, true. Serena, I've been analyzing reports from families and former students who have expressed serious concerns about coercive control techniques, financial exploitation, and dangerous psychological manipulation occurring in your wellness programs, Dr. Rodriguez said with the clinical precision that had made her successful in exposing fraudulent spiritual practitioners. Multiple individuals have reported experiences consistent with systematic brainwashing, including isolation from family and friends, coercive donation practices, and altered states of consciousness induced through unknown substances administered during meditation sessions. Additionally, several of your students have died under suspicious circumstances that warrant immediate investigation. The psychologist's identification of the coercive control patterns and her recognition of the systematic manipulation confirmed Serena's worst fears that her psychological techniques had been analyzed and connected to her fraudulent spiritual practices and suspicious student deaths. Serena's response was swift and deadly, as she realized that eliminating Dr. Rodriguez was essential for protecting her criminal operation and preventing exposure of her systematic brainwashing and murder spree. Dr. Rodriguez, I think your Western psychological framework may be creating resistance to understanding the profound spiritual transformations that occur when individuals surrender their ego attachments and embrace higher consciousness, Serena said, while discreetly reaching for a prepared vaporizer containing aerosolized datura toxin that she kept hidden among her aromatherapy equipment for emergency elimination of threats. Perhaps you could experience some of these advanced techniques directly, so you can understand the authentic spiritual processes that skeptical minds often misinterpret as manipulation or coercion. I have prepared a special meditation chamber where we can explore these deeper practices in a properly consecrated environment. Dr. Rodriguez agreed to observe Serena's meditation techniques, not realizing that the spiritual instructor was leading her into a soundproof room where previous murders had been committed and where Serena planned to expose her to the datura vapor that would cause fatal respiratory failure, while appearing to be an allergic reaction to exotic incense and meditation herbs. Serena's plan involved activating the hidden vaporizer system while Dr. Rodriguez was examining her meditation setup, causing immediate neurological dysfunction and respiratory collapse that would be attributed to unexpected sensitivity to spiritual aromatherapy rather than deliberate poisoning by a cult leader. But Serena's carefully planned murder of the psychologist was about to be prevented by the unexpected arrival of FBI agents who had been investigating cult activities and financial fraud associated with her wellness center. Special Agent Jennifer Walsh of the FBI's Organized Crime Division had been conducting a comprehensive investigation into cult manipulation and financial fraud operations that exploited vulnerable individuals seeking spiritual guidance. Agent Walsh specialized in investigating religious and spiritual fraud and had developed expertise in tracking criminal organizations that used legitimate-appearing spiritual practices to commit systematic theft and psychological abuse. The federal investigation had been initiated by reports from multiple families whose loved ones had become involved with Serena's wellness center and had subsequently died under suspicious circumstances or had transferred substantial assets to her organization through questionable means. The investigation had focused on Serena's activities after discovering that she had been operating under a false identity and had previous convictions for fraud and psychological manipulation. Agent Walsh had been conducting surveillance of Serena's operations and had documented evidence of systematic financial exploitation, psychological manipulation, and suspicious patterns of student deaths that suggested her spiritual practices were being used as cover for organized criminal activity. "Serena Kane, I'm Special Agent Walsh with the FBI," she announced as she entered the meditation chamber where Serena was preparing to murder Dr. Rodriguez. "I have federal warrants for your arrest on charges of organized fraud, conspiracy to commit murder, identity fraud, and multiple counts of first-degree murder related to your systematic exploitation of spiritual students and psychological manipulation for criminal purposes." Serena's reaction to the federal agent's intervention was a combination of narcissistic rage and desperate attempts to maintain her spiritual persona as she realized that law enforcement agencies had been investigating her cult activities and had connected them to systematic fraud and murder. Her carefully constructed identity as an enlightened guru had failed to protect her from federal investigation into her criminal psychological manipulation techniques. "Special Agent Walsh, you are interfering with sacred spiritual practices that transcend your limited understanding of higher consciousness," Serena said frantically, while abandoning her plan to poison Dr. Rodriguez and attempting to maintain her guru facade despite the overwhelming evidence against her criminal activities. "I am a vessel for ancient wisdom and divine guidance, helping suffering souls transcend their earthly attachments and achieve spiritual liberation. The transformations that occur through my teachings are beyond the comprehension of those who remain trapped in materialistic thinking." Dr. Rodriguez looked absolutely shocked as she realized how close she had come to being murdered by the spiritual instructor she had been investigating for cult manipulation. Her psychological analysis had not only exposed Serena's systematic fraud and murder spree, but it also prevented her own death at the hands of a killer who had been using spiritual practices as cover for systematic elimination of wealthy students. The comprehensive investigation that followed Serena's arrest revealed the full scope of her criminal enterprise and the sophisticated methods she had developed to exploit spiritual seeking for systematic fraud and murder. Forensic analysis of Serena's wellness center revealed extensive evidence of her psychological manipulation operations, including stockpiles of psychoactive plant toxins, sophisticated mind control equipment, and detailed profiles of vulnerable wealthy individuals that had been compiled for systematic targeting and exploitation. Her personal records showed coordination between student manipulation and financial theft, with each murder providing access to substantial assets through coercive donation schemes and inheritance fraud. The investigation also uncovered Serena's extensive network of accomplices who had been helping her maintain her false identity and had been participating in the systematic exploitation of spiritual students. Her criminal organization included corrupt lawyers who had helped manipulate estate planning, dishonest financial advisors who had facilitated asset transfers, and other fraudulent spiritual practitioners who had been operating similar schemes in different locations. Most disturbing was the discovery of Serena's detailed research into psychological vulnerability and her development of increasingly sophisticated brainwashing techniques that had been refined through years of exploiting grieving and seeking individuals who had trusted her with their spiritual development and financial resources. Serena Kane was ultimately convicted of 9 counts of first-degree murder, organized fraud, identity theft, conspiracy to commit systematic psychological manipulation, and numerous other charges related to her exploitation of spiritual practices for criminal purposes. The conviction sent unprecedented shockwaves throughout California's wellness and spiritual communities, prompting immediate reforms in spiritual practice licensing, psychological manipulation prevention, and student protection protocols. The case became a landmark example of how fraudulent spiritual practitioners could systematically exploit vulnerable individuals' spiritual seeking to commit large-scale fraud and murder while hiding behind the facade of enlightened teaching. Several other wellness centers and spiritual practitioners were investigated for similar criminal activities, resulting in enhanced oversight of the alternative spirituality industry and new requirements for background verification that made it more difficult for criminals to exploit spiritual practices for systematic abuse. Dr. Rodriguez and Special Agent Walsh received recognition for their collaborative investigation and became specialists in cult investigation, developing new techniques for identifying fraudulent spiritual practitioners and protecting vulnerable individuals from exploitation by predatory spiritual leaders. Isabella Montgomery and other surviving students required extensive deprogramming and psychological counseling to overcome the trauma of learning that their trusted spiritual guide had been systematically brainwashing and planning to murder them while stealing their assets. The wellness industry implemented comprehensive new safety protocols designed to protect students from exploitation by unethical spiritual practitioners. The case prompted comprehensive changes in spiritual practice regulation, including mandatory background checks for wellness practitioners, psychological evaluation requirements, enhanced oversight of student-teacher relationships, and new reporting procedures for suspicious spiritual activities involving financial exploitation or psychological manipulation. Serena's conviction also led to increased cooperation between spiritual practice licensing boards and law enforcement agencies investigating cult activities, with new protocols designed to identify spiritual practitioners who might be using religious or wellness practices to exploit vulnerable individuals for criminal purposes. The yoga and broader wellness industries implemented revolutionary new safety measures, including enhanced screening procedures for instructors, comprehensive student advocacy programs, mandatory reporting of suspicious spiritual manipulation, and improved training for recognizing signs of cult behavior and psychological abuse in spiritual settings. 5 years after Serena's conviction and life imprisonment, California's wellness community continued to implement safeguards designed to protect spiritual seekers from practitioners who might abuse their positions of trust and spiritual authority for criminal purposes. The yoga instructor, who had promised to guide students toward enlightenment and spiritual liberation, had instead used her psychological knowledge and spiritual authority to commit systematic brainwashing and murder against the very individuals who had trusted her with their spiritual development and personal transformation. However, her crimes had been thoroughly exposed, and her victims had found justice through the dedication of investigators who refused to accept suspicious deaths as spiritual accidents. Serena Kane's twisted poses had led her to a permanent position in prison, where she would serve multiple life sentences without possibility of parole, proving that even spiritual practitioners who attempted to exploit ancient wisdom traditions for criminal gain could be identified, investigated, and brought to justice when dedicated psychological experts and law enforcement agencies worked together to protect innocent seekers from predatory cult leaders. The yoga instructor's twisted poses had become her final spiritual position of justice, serving as a lasting reminder that authentic spiritual practice must be based on compassion and service rather than exploitation and control, and that those who would abuse spiritual authority to harm vulnerable seekers will ultimately face the full consequences of their betrayal of sacred trust and human decency. Thank you very much for listening. Please let us know what you think of this story in the comments. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Turn on notifications so you don't miss any other videos.